Welcome to Volume 6 in the series, W SÁNEĆ, the Saltwater People, with Mavis Underwood. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and rich history of the W SÁNEĆ Saltwater People and their traditional connection to their Salish Sea Homeland, including S DÁYES, South Pender Island. Mavis Underwood, a W SÁNEĆ elder, has been working to promote betterment and opportunities for First Nations and to influence needed social change in the areas of education, human and social development, health, and housing. She will speak about her lifetime of work in helping to facilitate social change and attempting to get pre-existing government systems to respond. She will share lessons she learned from her mother and father while growing up, and share a poem she wrote just after the birth of her first daughter. That and so much more. This recording was made in February 2024 on the grounds of the W SÁNEĆ School Board. Some of the stories in this interview may be unsettling for some listeners, so please, take care when listening. I am your host, Chris Wakaluk, and it is my pleasure to present this series to you. This series is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Historical Society. I would also like to thank my co-interviewer, Robert Dill, president of the SPHS. Without his help, this interview would not have been possible. Both of our voices have been extracted from this final audio in order to give maximum time and clarity to the interviewee to communicate and share their stories. Thank you for listening. Here is Mavis's story.
My name is Mavis Underwood. My traditional name is Thibornamat, and I come from Sayout First Nation, part of the SÁNEĆ Nation, and I'm daughter of late George Underwood and Geraldine Underwood, grown up as one of 16 children in that family in Sayout. I'm looking to share a poem, free writing that I wrote a long time ago when my first daughter, Josephine, who speelapte that, she was born. And when she was born in a compromised birth position. They call it Frank breech because the legs are up against their face. And when she was born, it was in 1984. And things have always been changing for First Nations people with respect to life in their communities, their reserve communities, access to housing. And there was still pressure on families to accept visitations from public health nurses. It was actually a requirement that once my baby and I were discharged from the hospital, there was a date set up for a public health nurse to come and watch me bathe my baby. And it was really troubling for me, because I had grown up in a large family and helped my mom and dad. I helped look after my siblings, and I had actually helped bathe newborn babies. And so I didn't really have any problem with it. It was always scary, but I didn't have any problem with it. But when suddenly I had to have this appointment with a public health nurse and bathe my baby in front of her, I just had really quite a flood of emotions, worried about how they would view me. Am I adequate? Am I a good mother? And my daughter, because she was born with this position, she was wearing cloth diapers, triple layer cloth diapers to realign her hip properly. So I washed and had a big supply of diapers and folded them properly because I wanted my husband to actually help sometimes change the baby. And he said, I can't fold the diapers. So I would always have them pre-folded. So when the nurse came in, she was quite impressed that I had this stack of diapers. I had a good spot for bathing my baby right beside the sink, and it was warm in the house. I was still nervous. I was sweating. as I was bathing my baby. And I didn't really say anything, but I was just trying to do what I knew how to do. And that's what I have to keep telling myself. You know how to do this. So I wrote Saltwater Woman, and it kind of expresses some of that concern about the oversight of First Nations by systems, social systems of health and education and policing, and sometimes the stress it puts families under. I was actually very fortunate. I had always worked. I had a good standard of living. I had a car. I was very, independent that way. But still, it strikes right at the heart when you realize somebody from the outside can actually say, you're not good enough. So this is my poem, Saltwater Woman by Mavis Underwood, and it was written June 2000. And my traditional name is Thiwanamat, and that's the name that was given to me from my mother, and she carried that name, and it came from our great-grandmother in Nanaimo. So now my daughter, Geraldine, carries the name, and my granddaughter, Gracie, carries the name. So it's been passed down. So it goes. Girl child, what will your life be? There is an instant your newborn eyes look into the eyes of your father, and he is afraid for you. His life has known toil, his life has known pain, and he worries what it holds for you. Each day you are tenderly bathed by the busy hands of your mother. She raises her cupped hand over your baby curls and imagines your future. Each drop of water is a prayer that you will find tenderness and love. At times it is not bath water, but loving tears that bathe you with hopes and dreams for a bright future. Girl child, growing up knowing to see two sides and maintain the middle, knowing the sacred responsibilities of life, fire and water. Fire to warm the elders' hearts and aching bones, water to cleanse the tired soul. There, too, in the play of children, you can see the healing of the nation. At times, what is in their minds enters your heart, and you help them to dream themselves whole. You come from the ancient ones, growing themselves up, and you know that means there will be mistakes. You work hard to try and be pure of heart, strong in mind and body, so that the mistakes will not weigh heavy on the people or stop the dreams for the future. In the young hearts you hear the desire to dance a new dance, and in the fire you see the ancestors calling you to join the old dance. Girl child searches near and far for wisdom and finds it's at home. She returns to her mother. Lying quietly on Mother Earth, she looks to Father Sky and she begins to dream. The birds have sung their morning song and now fly busily back and forth, singing their working song. You think of your grandpa and his many songs. You think of place and purpose as you remember Grandpa tenderly moving snakes nesting in the gravesite. As he toils moving the hard earth, he tells you that the snakes and the other creatures of the underworld help loosen the soil and give some relief to his troubled back. What you are afraid of, he cherished as friends. And you see the other side, always see the other side, and understand sometimes what you fear is what you need to know. It's always very emotional for me to read that. Lots of things come to mind about changes and sort of the dynamic sometimes in families and communities. My work has always been in helping people, like right from the beginning. I helped look after children in our family, and then I worked professionally here. Actually, this was one of my classrooms for learning support. I did the first learning support for some of the First Nations children here. And it was really hard because I was working here in the early 80s. Department of Indian Affairs was still funding First Nations education, but they had put the bulk of the resources into public school education. So the school here was really struggling for that recognition. And one of the areas of recognition was needing to have financial support for special needs children. And so some of the special needs children were coming here, but there was not a lot of programming or service or support. So that was my job sometimes, to help take them out of class and read with them, help do maybe a little bit of life skills, give them a little bit of coaching, or give the teacher a bit of respite, and then let them go back to the classroom. It was very early in the idea of special needs education, and it's kind of an interesting piece of the puzzle, because in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s, 60s period was often taking special needs children from their parents at birth. So if a child was born with a hearing defect, a vision defect, a physical handicap, they would be taken away and they would be placed in a specialized foster home. And the parental rights were often severed almost immediately, so the parents would not have any more connection with their special needs child until that child reached adulthood, and the provincial system would often just kick them back out. And it was really an unfortunate time for First Nations, because adapting our communities, creating ramps for homes and additional bathrooms for growing families, for modifying a bathroom if your elderly parents had strokes, none of that was in the capacity of available housing dollars. So if you did have a child that was born with cerebral palsy or something, and they needed specialized wheelchairs, if they needed other mobility aids, if they needed therapy, it wasn't often coming to reserve. So it was very, very difficult for many young parents. It was also quite an industry that the province had cultivated in creating another system of care of First Nations that sort of blossomed out of residential school. And even though the residential schools were starting to close, there was still a lot of pressure put on First Nations families to still send their children to residential school. They were being persuaded that it was easier, that they wouldn't have to pay for feeding them, and that they would get a better education. So to me, it was a very difficult time to start analyzing systems and trying to figure out why things work this way. So I got quite involved in looking at social policy, looking at ideas of social policy reform, looking at the human rights issues that were starting to be teased out. I knew many of the First Nations leaders from other provinces that were still traveling to the United Nations in New York to try to appeal to have greater recognition of human rights for Indigenous peoples worldwide. And many of those First Nations leaders spent a lot of time out of their communities, away from their families, to try to lobby for those impressions. And when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was finally complete, people are quite aware that Canada did not embrace it. British Columbia did not embrace it. So there was almost this impossibility to make change because of a lot of the social portfolio, health, education, child and family services, housing. All of that would rest a lot of times as transfer dollars from the feds to the province. So the province didn't want to give up any of that portfolio. And so it became a real difficult challenge to governance in First Nations communities. How do you mobilize that need when there's a heavy competition for those same dollars? And so I think that kind of social change, we started to get a little bit more momentum with UNDRIP, also with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 90s. traveling around. We started to get recognition here locally with the declaration of the SÁNEĆ people. They wanted the 4 chiefs of the area, David Bill, Ed Mitchell, Lou Claxton, and I can't remember if it was one of the Olsons or who was the chief in Charlotte at the time. But anyway, those chiefs signed that declaration, and it was really to start to try to breathe life into the treaty, because although we've never assumed that the treaty was completed, it was really inappropriately drafted, drawn up, with signatures collected separately from the treaty document, and the promise of having lands protected and surveyed, which never happened. Then that's the part of the story with Leltos. Leltos, to me, such a beautiful island. It's almost like a superstore, because my father was born in 1924, and he grew up in his youth knowing a lot of the outreach islands, the Gulf Islands, and he would harvest everything, all different kinds of crab, clams, shellfish, salmon. He knew them all the different kinds of salmon that were in our bays, all the whitefish he knew, halibut. He knew them all. He knew where to get them. So if elders came to my father and they asked for seagull eggs, when they were feeling weak, they would ask for seagull eggs. My dad would take probably about half an hour to just go out, get some seagull eggs. I've never eaten them, but I was really touched when I saw the sack of them, because they're beautiful, actually. They're quite different. They're speckled, they're dark, all different patterns. I was just really fascinated when I was a kid looking at that sack of seagull eggs. But my dad was like that. He knew freedom. He knew independence. He knew self-sufficiency. So when we grew up that way, we never really worried. You know, like many kids that had been taken off to residential school, we were lucky. And we worked. I knew how to work right from, like what I said, I looked after my brothers and sisters, but then I also helped my mom go pick berries. So I knew how to work, and then I knew how to start making my own money. And that was important, because I helped sometimes get vegetables or fruit or whatever for lunches, or, you know, get my own shoes or whatever it might be. But it was really important to have that independence. And a lot of people didn't have it. They were deliberately being kept poor. And we didn't have a lot of money either, but my dad and my mom, they knew how to get food. My dad harvested, my mom canned. So when we did have another visit from a public health nurse, they asked to look in our fridge, and all it had was 2 big jugs of powdered milk, because we used to get this institutional powdered milk. I think it was left over from the residential schools. They would bring it to our home, and you'd stir it up really hard and leave it in the fridge. It's usually better if you left it 2 days, but if you left it 1 day, it would taste almost like milk. But 2 days was usually better. So we'd have those big jugs of milk in the fridge, and then and that's sometimes all we had. And that day the nurse came, that's all we had. And she goes, "Oh, good, at least you've got milk." And then my mom said, "Oh, we have lots of food." And she took her down to the basement, the earth basement, and there was all kinds of canned fish, canned deer, fruit, peaches, cherries. My mom was really, really, really hardworking. You know, I can't match that ethic that she had, because she was still doing laundry by hand, having to haul water and heat water, and she was a knitter. You know, she just had this tremendous work ethic, and she was working all the time, plus having babies. You know, like I could just aspire to be half the woman she was. Yeah, so it was certainly very different times, and my folks always encouraged me to keep working. They encouraged that direction into public school, because my dad believed it was really important to learn how to get along. And so even though I was scared to walk to school by myself, I walked there, followed my big brothers, and I did well at school. Because I came from a big family, they started practicing reading and numbers with me. They were very conscious of what they would say as brothers. Don't look dumb. So they would coach me, make me read all the labels of cans, cereal boxes, comic books. I would read their comic books. And to me, it was just words. It never really went into stories until, I was a little bit older. But I was a really good reader after. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me, we had a visit from the public library at our school, and they were giving the kids library cards. And I couldn't get one because they told me I wasn't a taxpayer. And I didn't know what that meant. And I went home and I said to my mom, I said, Mom, they were giving out library cards for the public library at the school today, but they told me I couldn't have one because I'm not a taxpayer. What does that mean? And she said, it means you're an Indian and you live on the reserve, so you can't borrow books from the library. And I went, oh, it was just a big disappointment, but I didn't know what I could do about it. But then there was a man that drove with a bookmobile, and he came and he parked beside our house. And I was able to get, at least for a year, I was borrowing about 5 books at a time. And I think I was in about grade 3. And the popular books were all the Walter Farley Black Stallion books. So I was borrowing that, and I must have borrowed Black Beauty as well, a dozen more times. And like I said, I'm a really voracious kind of a reader. I just had to read. And sometimes I'd take a book home, and our house was very crowded. And I'd get up at night, sit in a chair, and read from night till morning to finish my book so I could start another one. And it was just really important for me to be able to read. And that's what helped me with my schooling. By the time I was growing up, I was born in 1953. By that time, we weren't so free. We weren't so free to go to travel to the islands, partly because you started to end up having to take other systems. Like I said, First Nations, the Indian Act was really starting to impose itself on First Nations people. Federal fisheries as well was starting to impose control on First Nations. Once the reserve system was set up, they almost tried to set it up that you would have to maintain a curfew. You would have to show your identification and things like that. And it was still illegal to sell liquor to First Nations, so many people were sneaking around to do that. And it was really an awkward time, right? There was a lot of things that were very compromising. Like my father had said he went to war in the 40s, right from residential school. He didn't return back, and after grade 6, he didn't return because nobody was hiring First Nations too. It was almost natural that a lot of First Nations would sign up for military service. So my father was 17, and he signed up with the Princess Patricia Light Infantry and went into World War II. He was following his brother, who was in the Canadian Scottish, and his brother Ed died after the war and was buried in Holton Canadian Cemetery in the Netherlands. And his older brother Ben was also in the military, but he served locally in British Columbia, road building, bridge building, helping get resources out to support the war. So he was, I think they were called Royal Engineers. So he was a laborer. And my uncle ended up, of course, at the end of the war, was a janitor in one of the public schools. And that's where he retired. Yeah, so, but my father knew it was really hard to find good work, particularly work that paid First Nations enough. Like a lot of times people didn't want to pay First Nations. They wanted to trade with them. My father luckily, my father always had good things to trade. He was a fisherman. He would trade fish, smoked fish, sometimes for a side of beef or some bacon or pork. Or he always had good trades. He crabbed at the time when Saanich Bay was rich with crabs. And he was what you would call a super harvester. He knew how to harvest and how to feed people. And so he knew that kind of freedom. So when it came time for service to sign up, he believed that it was the right thing to do because of the freedom that he'd experienced. My dad still traveled to the different spots, but because of the time was changing, like we always didn't see the plan. We just ate the food that came of it. But I remember my mom telling me a story about Pender and my father being down. He brought his truck over to Pender, and he was right down. There's a little park and stuff there, but it used to be the Pender Canal area. You could actually bring your vehicle down, and they were all digging. I think they were digging clams. So it was helpful if you could get the vehicle closer because the bags were usually over 100 pounds. Yeah. But yeah, I would have loved to know. The thing that I always find when I get invited to any of the outer islands now is I do feel that I've been here before and I'm very comfortable there. I just don't, I don't travel there very much myself. And it's that whole thing. It's like with Leltos, in about the 70s, it started to be a place where we were told to stay out, stay away, stay off. And they also plowed under one of the cemeteries there, the burial grounds. They plowed it into the water so that those Indians wouldn't visit their relatives. And they were trying to remove all our markers, our civilization there, even though there's still ancestral remains there. There's probably a lot of artifact remains, but it's been privatized. So for a long time, they just tried to get us to stay away from it. And they had security there that would tell us, you can come up this far, but you can't go any further. Yet that was one of the areas where a lot of missionaries had been planting apples and plums everywhere. So they were trying to influence us to start growing things that way. So there was a lot of apples there, and our people would go over there and gather apples. Well, actually, it's hard to say when things occurred, like what was the timeline, but there was, Leltos operated as a munitions plant for World War I and World War II. And then it became a munitions plant after the war, and the people who worked in the munitions factory lived there. They had some really nice homes over there. Then there was a big explosion, and they had to move all of the buildings, the homes, everything off of there. And it started to then move that progression to become privatized. Well, it was actually privatized when all those employees were living there, but it's done really outside of First Nations consultation, contact, discussion. It's probably occurring at the government, federal government, provincial government level, and this is often where Crown land becomes surplus land and just slides away. But really, a lot of Crown land is land that's been taken back from lands that were reserved for Indians. So the feds would keep it as Crown land, or they would disperse it to the province as Crown land. And so those Crown lands are really, to me, Indigenous First Nations land. They haven't properly been dealt with. The whole history of how they slipped out of reserve lands, or it's called lands reserved for Indians. When it slips out of lands reserved for Indians and it becomes either defense purposes or it becomes, some kind of federal operation, a corrections facility, many of that is what you see happening on those lands reserved for Indians. there's usually a federal purpose, might be a railway yard, something like that. So that's the concern that I have, is getting people to really look at that history of land and land acquisition, land disposal, because of the way our history is extinguished on the land. I recently did a part of a field study with UVic and SAOT because we wanted to look at our ancestral village in Salish. Salish is Cadova Bay, and Salish is one of our oldest village sites. And it's had a lot of interference. It became, as privileged people began to settle in what started to become British Columbia, when they started to settle here, there was privileged people that were starting to run the government and look at surveying and looking at, what does this area need to grow? So it was also very sort of inside. People that knew people would be attracted to come and live here. So that area, Salish, Cadova Bay, became the summer homes for many of Victoria's wealthy people. They would come by horse and buggy to their beach homes. And so more and more we were being kind of forced off. And during contact diseases, many of the village areas were just burnt out. If people were away fishing or visiting other relatives, or, the whole process of survival often was meant being away, gathering, looking for water, whatever it might be. Our people were very displaced. They were very dispersed. They were not the same thriving kind of people. They were dying of contact illness, but they were also dying of violence. And so it was a very difficult time for us, and it's still a difficult, it's a difficult history to consider how people were being extinguished, and it was outside the law. Like, no one would often investigate or anything like that. So when we got to Salish, it was really a lot of the motivation as well to look at what our history was there. Still a lot of ancestral remains there, sometimes in fragments because development has blown up the foundations of the villages for the foundations of their developments. So that's what I think is really hard, that consideration of history without your markers. So part of my work is, and like this work, really reflects on that. What's your past and how far back can you go? So people always talk about, when did you get here? When did your people settle here? And they say, was it 5,000? Was it 10,000? Was it 20,000 years ago? It's from the beginning of time. When you talk about creation, it's from that beginning of time. And the idea of needing to put and government always loves a certainty marker on it, because they want to continue to negate your history, that it's not important. But one of the things that's there, that's incredible, at the Salish in the bay there, is a great fish wall. It's very large. And we had it scanned by UVic engineering, ground penetrating radar, that's what they call it. So they scanned it, and the depth of the rocks that we could see actually go down about 3 feet. So you could picture this wall surrounding all kinds of seafood. And we actually did that. They did some drone photography and mapping of the fish wall at very low tide last summer. And the students in my cohort, I wasn't actually taking a credit course. I was just there as a helper. And we were uncovering the rocks. And there's chitin, and there's crabs, and there's clams, little fishies, snails, those yellow snails that look like lemons, they were there. And of course, all the crows and the ravens and eagles are walking around that fish wall, because there's lots of food there still. But I said, all of it is that reminder, what we learned here from late Dave Elliott, and other teachers, when the tide goes out, the table is set. So when my dad would crab, he would follow the tide out because he said the crabs are walking. They're following the water out. That's when you can get them. So when the tide goes out, your food's there. You just have to go and get it. So when the tide goes out in a fish wall, there's all kinds of seafood in there. But to me, somebody who's always looked after children, I look at it as a very sustainable way to gather your food, and it's a very safe way to gather your food. You don't have to worry about having a boat, floating a boat, life jackets, weather. You're kind of going out there and you're grazing for your food. And it is, like I said, a very safe way to get food. And such a rich variety of food. Like I was really excited about it. I didn't eat anything from there because there still is a lot of sewage outfall from the homes there. But you can eat crab. But the only crab that we saw was a little bit too small. But there is possibility, a lot of possibility. And that's also for Sayout First Nation. We're trying to give back to the ocean. We have a seaweed farm. We're in partnership with Cascadia Seaweed. And it's actually a site that often gets visited by other areas, other First Nations, or other communities that want to build a seaweed farm. They come and they look at it. And because of how it's set up there in SÁNEĆ Bay, it marks our protected rights there, because we won the SÁNEĆ Bay Marina case in 1988. But we also defended Douglas Treaty rights, protected rights to fishery. And I said, people have to understand rights to fishery means more than just catching a fish. It means, what do fish need to live? So it's protecting the water, the fresh water, the saltwater ecosystem, making sure that the geese don't overpopulate and pull out all of the grasses that the salmon need to habitate in. And also, of course, cool the water. A lot of the climate actions that we're taking, looking at ways to cool the water, bring back the coolness to the water. So the idea for myself in looking out and reaching out to Cascadia Seaweed was to give back to the ocean. I would love to make billions of dollars. Maybe I would. I don't know if I really would. But that wasn't really the purpose. The purpose for me was, we need to give back to you because you've given us. And that's the way I grew up, with so much variety in my food. I miss it sometimes. I still get crab sometimes and a little bit of clams. Salmon I could still eat, a lot of times now I pay for it. I pay for it to make sure I can have it because it's such a privilege. But the seaweed farm, it's really nice to visit it, to go there, see how it keeps seeding itself. It's spreading out beyond the boundaries of the farm, and it's spreading itself, seeding itself. So these great big bull kelps are providing a thick canopy, and these cormorants are on the buoys. And there's probably about 8 to 10 of them on these buoys. I imagine there's a lot of fish in there. We didn't stay out there quite long enough, and it was a little bit windy, but I imagine if we had a glass-bottom boat, we could see a lot of life there. And so that's what I keep asking them. What is coming back under this canopy of kelp? And they have the other seaweeds that they harvest from there. To me, it's a really beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to happen. I have a good friend. Her name's Ellen Kelsey. She writes environmental literature and children's literature, educating children about anxiety, grief, and loss. And how do you build hope? One of her books is called Hope Matters, and it's about protecting the environment. That's what I really want to have, is this relationship where I can always find hope, a reservoir of hope, where, like for myself, I get really excited about the young people that have such great artwork, that they're using all different kinds of media now. They do podcasts, they do web pages, they do animation, they do voice-activated computers, they do all kinds of things, that I'm too scared to touch. I do keyboarding, write my stories, but, I don't go into greater dimensions than that, really. But that's what really makes me excited, is to see they're doing performing arts, they're singing. Too bad we didn't go up to witness the protocol. Every day the school starts with protocol. And that is something that's really powerful to me, because it's reclaiming education back from residential school. This is what the kids would have lost, was the way to be expressing gratitude, to practicing language, to having their teachers be their own relatives, their aunties, their uncles, their grandparents, and then the support workers as well. It's really quite a powerful learning community that is here at the school. And so, the children sing and they perform dances and they drum as a way to greet the day. And it reminds me of those first teachings that I had heard about birds. Birds get busy in the morning, they sing, and it's like that's their morning prayer, their morning song. Then they get to work. They're busy, flying all over looking for food. And then at night, when it starts to get dark, they sing another song, and they go to sleep. And it's to remind us that, we start that day with gratitude, that posture of gratitude, and happy that you have a day to do this. So I try to remember that, and that's what I see when I see the kids. They're just remarkable to watch them. And that idea of what they're getting back, they're overcoming all of the sadness that their parents or grandparents experienced with residential school, that aversion to learning, all of the psychological challenges that have been inflicted on our communities because of separation anxiety or trauma, compound trauma, grief and loss. So, the children are emerging to be very powerful, a powerful force for change. But we need to help continue to support that. We need to work on improving our own health, our facilities, our homes, our communities. That's really important. I want it to be better than just Every Child Matters bumper sticker or a t-shirt, orange t-shirt. I want us to begin to reflect it in what we build for children. The school, this beautiful school, it has a well-equipped gym. It has a well-equipped library. It has playing fields, so that children can be playing under the watchful eyes of their teachers and support workers. And they also have support counseling here for kids. And that's really important to do that, because before they just suffered in silence. So, the reclamation of language, the reclamation of stories, the reclamation of joy is really important to me. So the idea of writing from that place of overcoming, it's good to me. And what I'm hoping is that it encourages other people to do that as well, because it creates that inspiration or that legacy or that teaching somebody forward, right? The music too, the music that's emerging, the young people that now sing rap, and record, and they go to a recording studio and they have no qualms about singing music that they've written. That's just amazing to me. Well, what are you going to do about it? That's something that I did learn from my father. Sometimes you do have to stand up and you have to challenge someone who's trying to put you down. And somebody saying that education is wasted on women because they assume that you're just going to start having children. That's your aspiration in life, is to find the right man and start having children. And certainly that's maybe one aspect of fulfillment, but it may not be for every woman. It certainly was for me, but I think there's a lot of scarring of women that started with the missionaries, given being told that they need to undermine the strength, the resourcefulness, the power of women, the influence of women, if you want to be able to start colonizing and assimilating and changing Indians. If you want them to buy in, you have to create a challenge on the women so that the idea of women being an extension of the male identity, the male property, was part of the backdrop of starting to attack women and disrespecting women and diminishing the power of women and forgetting that there's a sacred relationship with life givers and water. And so I think that kind of hardship, what do you do with it? Like, that's why the idea of hope is something really important to me. A lot of the work that I was involved in, as I said, was starting to challenge systems. How do systems respond to women? Particularly if there's violence in the home, if there's violence, spousal violence or violence against children. And in the periods that I was working, 70s and 80s, there was still a lot of indifference to the concerns that were being brought forward for women who were being battered, for children that were being abused. There was a lot of indifference. The rights of Indigenous First Nations men, in many cases, were being protected so that they were often being allowed to stay in the home, and the women and children would have to leave. So it started to create a lot of high risk for children in that they were being displaced from their family and displaced from the community that they knew. And it was all tied into this identification of who's an Indian and who has a right to be here on this land. So that is exemplified in your status number. So if you have a status number, that number follows me for my health services, including my dental, when I pay for my tax-free gas, when I buy my tax-free cigarettes, or I go tax-free shopping in Duncan. And that's the way it's always been. So an Indian child that would be getting educated, that's a billable number. If you need eyeglasses, it's a billable number that it's charged to. And that identification often came from the man of the house. So if a woman's marriage broke up, she would often be asked to leave the reserve. This was probably only in the 60s and 70s. There was very detrimental treatment of women. It was very secretive, but it wasn't a well-kept secret. It was like a loud secret that women were being battered and turfed out and sexually assaulted, and children were often at risk as well. I followed my mother and other women into helping professions, into being an advocate, sometimes for the health and safety of women. And sometimes people maligned me because I worked with policing. But one of the reasons why I worked with policing was I needed to get policing to actually intervene in some extreme situations of violence, and sometimes to remove children who were in dire straits of poverty or neglect, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't kick down somebody's door, and I needed help. And it was really a difficult time to be involved in looking at women's issues and child welfare issues. And of course, it wasn't something that was just unique to First Nations. In many places, it was occurring. And a lot of people felt it was the privilege of family. It was family business and no outside system had a right to penetrate that. So sometimes, it was very challenging to get involved in that work and to go through like this idea of social change. How do you start getting systems to respond to you? How do you get them to listen to you when they believe that the children that are disclosing sexual abuse for 10 or 12 years are telling lies, or they're involved in a conspiracy against a certain family? But the thing that I found with a lot of the children, they were very consistent in their disclosure. And a lot of times they didn't want anything to happen. They just wanted the situation of abuse or violence, sexual violence, to stop. So, that was some of the work that I did in the 80s and 90s. I actually was recognized with a Derek Thompson Social Policy Award way back then for speaking about the rights of victims. And I still do that now because it's, it hasn't all gone away. The world hasn't magically healed itself. There's still a lot of oppression and violence and taking advantage and bullying. So I'm glad to be, as long as I have the energy, you just have to stand up and do what's right. And that's what my dad, he had challenges too himself with alcoholism and violence, but he would throw that down. What are you going to do about it? So you had to do something about it. And I was lucky that I was kind of sheltered by my older brothers who said, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. And, I never thought that I was a statistic of abuse myself because I had managed to fight and get away. So I had actually survived dangerous circumstances, but I never counted it until I started being with women in circle and they would talk about their abuse. And then I would tell them, I never talked about it before, but I was actually in a very similar situation where I was being attacked by several men and I was able to get away. But I never thought I was part of a statistic, but I am. And it was just the way that women were often treated, particularly First Nations women. And it was really hard to get through and penetrate institutional culture, the public service culture, the attitudes towards First Nations people. Because people learned that. They learned that history in school. This is the history of colonization, and this is how we treat Indians. We have to treat them as poor people who are ignorant. And if I look at the resourcefulness of anyone, like my father or my grandfather, they built commercial fishing boats. Some of the most beautiful boats that were ever built were built by First Nations builders. And they were taught by the Ordano family, who had relationships, partnerships with our Underwood family. And what was interesting to see is how those boats with the curved bows in some of the homes that my father and other Underwoods built had curved archways in the homes. And they had air exchange systems, like portholes at the ceiling, close to the ceiling, so that heat could go back and forth from room to room. It was just amazing to me. It's really unfortunate that a lot of those homes are gone now, but they really knew how to build in a really powerful way. And it came from learning how to build these boats. So, yeah, I am very fortunate to have a lot of that strength in me. And I believe it comes from a lot of the prayer that's for you from your family, but also understanding your relationship with the environment and with nature. It's not an accident that food's provided for you through creation. It's not science. Science didn't invent the sun and the moon and put them up there and create tides. That's creation. So I try to remember that and not overstep or use too much or, and so, always try to give back. That's kind of the work that I still try to do, give back, because I had a good education. I am a strong person. I know how to do things. I know how to write. I know how to help people through some grief and loss. Yeah, so that's what you're supposed to do. Because if you do that, it comes back to you in other ways. So now that I'm getting on in my life, it does come back to me in other ways. When I go speak at a class, sometimes people give me gifts. It's just the best thing. Students give me gifts. The last class, I had some fireweed syrup and some honey from Alberta. When people give you things that are sweet, it's because partly they've had a teaching that they need to give you the sweetness in life. So if they give you a strawberry, they're trying to give you that. And that strawberry too, with the volume of seeds that it has, is it's about, wishing you a future. It might be fertility, but it may be also be wishing you that future. And again, that sweetness in life, that blessing in your life. So I really am happy for things like that people learn well and respect you for what you do. So yeah, the women's issues have been really tough for not only First Nations women, but any oppressed. They have to break down the women through acts of violence to conquer and take over a family or a community, a land. I don't get to talk about it very much. I was on the cover of a Maclean's magazine once in the 90s because the story about abuse and abuse in the communities went national. So Maclean's came and photographed me down in Pukwudgie, and other people revisited that question about would you have done it again? Well, probably, because the work needs to get done, right? You just have to do it. And if someone is calling on you to do it or to help them, you have to help them. Not often supposed to say, I'm too busy.
Thank you very much to Mavis for doing this interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.